Warren, thanks for having me in your home.
It's really a pleasure to have you in my home. I think I'll know at the end of the interview.
Yes, we'll see how this goes. You're speaking to the enemy right now. You were one of the original advocates of second wave feminism in the 1970s. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was, first of all, absolutely, you're correct. And I was on the board of the National Organization for Women in New York City, and then was reelected and then reelected again. And so I ultimately ended up being the only man ever elected 3 times to the board of NOW in New York City. And had I was speaking all around the world on behalf of feminist issues and then I began to evolve in 2 ways. I began to say that it's really important for both men and women to understand each other. And Gloria Steinem used to say, what the world needs more is more women at work and more men at home, and as fathers especially. And I very much agreed with that and still agree with that overall today, that part of feminism. But then while I was on the board of NOW, as in the early 70s, there was a number of women were writing in and saying, we're getting divorces. And I don't like your equality idea of having men having equal time with the children. I, the mom, knows what's best for the children. I care more about the children. I want to be fully involved with the children, and I want to be able to move with a new man in my life to wherever I wanted to move, or be with a woman and move with her to wherever we want to move. And I don't want to have my life saddled by the man I chose to marry, who happens to be the father of my children, who isn't, by the way, that great a father, was the argument. And my response was, insofar as the small amount of research that I've read, there's children who have their biological father in their life, not their stepfather, but their biological father, seem to do a lot better than children who don't. But the research at that point, early 70s, was really fairly new, and there was not a huge ability, the database was not great enough to be able to really make sure that you weren't confusing correlation with causality. So I started doing some research on that, but the more I did, the more I confronted the board of NOW and said, we've got to decide here. This is either a political organization which is afraid to lose its base of additional feminists because they feel that they want to have the priority being themselves, or we're an organization that advocates equality. And if we're an organization that advocates equality, that would start with, there's nothing that's more fundamental to the human being than children. And if you don't have an equal amount of involvement with the children, what I'm hearing you say is that you care more about women than you care about children, and of children of both sexes. And they were receptive and non-receptive to that. They were receptive in the sense that they said, yes, you have an argument there, and it is a valid conflict. But in the final analysis, everybody except myself and Karen DeCrow, who wasn't part of the New York City NOW, but was a former national president of NOW, everybody except the 2 of us said that they were going to go with the politics. And so that's when I began to start saying, how much I have to really watch now. Is this politics of making sure you never alienate anybody in your constituency? And their argument was, yeah, it needs to be politics because we have so many agendas, and we have to serve women on every level, and we have to be as politically strong as possible to do that. And mine is, if you lose your integrity, if you aren't showing the world that women care not only just about themselves, but about their children as well, once they make that commitment, then you're really undermining the integrity of the women's movement.
Your version of feminism was making sure that everybody had equal opportunity, mm-hmm. and that everyone was treated equally under the law. Correct. Almost a libertarian perspective on this.
Yes, very much so. I mean, this is one of the reasons I think, that I spoke recently at the Capitalism and Morality Conference up in Canada, which is as you probably know, a libertarian conference. And and libertarians have been very attracted to my work because they see it more as he's more concerned with opportunity than outcome. And one of the great tragedies of liberalism has been that they have confused, or maybe not confused intellectually, maybe purposely confused outcome and opportunity. And so they are saying, we want equal numbers of women in tech, we want equal numbers of female lawyers or doctors, we want equal numbers, but never we need to have equal numbers of firefighters. We need to have equal numbers of women in the combat and the military. We need to have equal amounts of draft registration for women. There's no mention of the lack of draft registration for women. There's no mention of the fact that the whole concept of voting was voting based on the fact that you had an investment, that you had property, that you had money, you had an investment in the system, and you had obligations to the system, and as a result of that obligations, you had an opportunity to vote to control that. And when women got the opportunity to vote, there was zero required of them. For us as men, if you have a son, he's still required to register for the draft, and if he doesn't, $250,000, never any opportunity to work for anyone that related to the federal government. You can't go to a college and get a scholarship if it's involved with federal opportunities, because you are eliminated from that if you're a male.
So oddly enough, your feminism led you to found, a lot of people attribute you as the founding father of the men's movement, the fathers movement.
Yes.
I suspect some of this analysis probably alienates you with some of your friends in the traditional feminist movement.
I had to redefine what a friend was, because among my friends were Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and people who were significantly players in the feminist movement. And I thought, and I didn't realize that if a person breaks from you because you differ in their ideology, is that a friend? Or is a friend somebody who respects your integrity and listens to you very well and requires you to listen to him or her and to represent them well as well? And is that what a friend is? And I would say that the most important characteristic for me of a friend is integrity, and then also the ability of that friend to be able to put down other priorities and go out of their way to be involved with me at points in time that I need them and expect the same of me.
A lot of young people are romanced by democratic socialism, and as a libertarian, I'm sort of banging my head against the wall. Do you understand the history of socialism in practice? You understand that these are deadly ideologies. That it's not. Whatever the intentions are, it's just raw authoritarianism.
Yes.
You're a trained political scientist, and you've looked at particularly Vladimir Lenin's attitude about women in the family. Talk a little bit about that.
One of the things I saw was that what we had was a very unfortunate confluence of political forces. We had the civil rights movement, which was so valid in saying that there is an oppressor and an oppressed. Then we had the Marxist movement, which was more arguably distinguishing the oppressor and the oppressed. But the feminist movement bought those two hierarchical systems of saying there's an oppressor and an oppressed. So rather than seeing the family as a family boat where everyone was working together for the benefit of everyone, making different types of sacrifices so that their children could have a life that had more options than they had, the feminist movement, the early feminist movement, saw they saw men as the new oppressor and women as the new oppressed. They saw patriarchy as being the dominating force. What I tried to explain is that patriarchy is not the dominating force. The need to survive was the dominating force, and almost every father that I was aware of who had any respect for himself as a father, he gave up the glint in his eye to be able to, the glint in his eye meaning the glint to be an artist, the glint to be a writer, the glint to be a roughhouse with his grandchildren. He gave up the glint in his eye to be able to do something that was less fulfilling to him, because most things that are fulfilling pay very little. And so,
I know this from personal
yes,
experience.
yes, I was going to say, you and I both know this from personal experience. The more fulfilling you do something, the more fulfilling something is, the more people want to do it. But the more people that want to do it do not necessarily match with the demand for that.
Right.
So there's an enormous supply-demand gap between fulfillment and the need for that. So most people need their garbage picked up more than they need somebody who specialized in art history to tell them more about art history. And so the person who picks the garbage up gets, a bonus for doing something that's needed. But not that many people define picking up garbage as their greatest joy in life. And so the people, so fathers have historically given up what they wanted to do, the glint in their eye, in order to do what they had to do. Do what they had to do to be able to have their children do less of what they had to do. So example, I'm traveling in New York City with Gloria Steinem in a cab. And the cab driver recognizes Gloria, not me, and says, you that Gloria Steinem woman? She says, yes. And she says, so what are you going to do? Some TV show? Yes. And we were going to do a show with N.O.W, who was hosting a morning show in New York. And the cab driver goes, so what are you going to talk about? We said, inequality and power. And so cab driver, long pause. He comes back and says, well, I earn more money than my wife. And so does that mean I have more power than she does? And so we sort of hesitated. Fortunately, he didn't allow us enough time to really give a good answer, and which we couldn't have had. And he said, I work 70 hours a week. Almost all the cab drivers here work 70 hours a week. Do you think that I work 70 hours a week because I want more power? Or do you think that this is taking power away from me, from doing what I really want to do? Well, the answer is obvious. And then he said, I'm working 70 hours a week driving a cab so my son, my daughter don't have to drive cabs. So they have a life they can afford education and that I could never afford. And so I'm hoping that happens. But what many of these cab drivers found is that they did finally save up enough money. That was some combination of scholarships and maybe federal aid allowed them to go to school. And then their daughters in particular were likely to go into social sciences and then come back and define their father as an oppressor. And so that didn't feel too good to a lot of men. Yeah. And that's sort of a summary of what a lot of men have felt, that the obligation to earn money, instead of saying, thank you, Dad, for doing your job, your obligation, giving up the glint in your eye to support me to have more opportunities than you have, has gotten translated into, if you're successful as a dad, you're called the oppressor. Yeah. And if you're not successful as a dad, you're called a loser. Well, either way, you lose as a man. And that has been the enormous injustice, distortion that has created this enormous male-female gap that is sad, because for the first time in human history, we don't any longer have to have the rigid roles of the past of women raise children, men raise money. We have opportunities to move into a gender liberation movement in which we can be free from the rigid roles of the past and have much more flexible roles for our future. And the feminist movement, while it opened up many doors for women, no one has opened up equal doors for men. And so today what you have is this when a woman becomes pregnant, she says some version to herself like, I'm going to check with 3 different options. I can either work full-time, or I can be full-time involved with my children, or I can do some combination of both. And the husband says, well, I have 3 options too. I can work full-time, or I can work full-time, or I can work full-time, or be a loser. Right. And so we've developed this era of the multi-option woman and the no-option man. And that's created an enormous, uncommon wisdom among our sons, who look at their lives and say, is there anything appealing to me in my life as a man? And oftentimes the smartest and most sensitive boys don't feel that there is.
And this is a perfect segue to a book you're releasing very soon, called The Boy Crisis. Tell me the thesis. What is the boy crisis?
Well, I was looking around the world at things like the PISA results. The PISA is a test that is given all around the world through the UN to boys and girls, and found that in the 63 largest developed nations, boys were falling significantly behind girls, particularly in the two areas that most predict success, and that is reading and writing. And so then I started asking, well, why the developed nations? And what I found that developed nations had in common is that they had enough economic luxury to be able to afford permission for divorce. And when there was permission for divorce, there was usually either much less father involvement or no father involvement or conditional father involvement. That is, the father was involved on the condition that he fathered in the way the mother felt the father should father. And so he was in a hierarchical position in relation to the mother. And therefore, he eventually felt so gate-kept that he began to lose interest in his own children and hoped to have more love from a new woman. And then that led to who had children and be accepted more as a father. And then, so as a stepfather, he hoped to have some more acceptance than he did with his biological children. And so throughout the world, the developed world, there started to become one of two things. There were divorces that led to much less father involvement, and there was enough permission for mothers to have children without fathers involved at all, that is, without being married. And when mothers have children without being married, almost always they have insignificant father involvement or no father involvement or conditional father involvement. So today, 51% of women who are 30 and under have children without being married, which means that there's a great likelihood that by the age of 3, there will be no father involvement or very minimal father involvement with those children.
And this kind of talk must very much confuse people because you're starting to sound like a conservative right now.
Well,
you've surely been accused of this before.
Yes, I should be acknowledged for it, and so I should be acknowledged, hopefully, by both liberals and conservatives for thinking things through in a way that leads to children having a better life.
Yeah.
So the challenge with there not being fathers and there not being a strong family is that so for example, just very concretely and scientifically, by the age of 9. Children who do not have significant father involvement, their telomeres are 14% shorter. Telomeres are that little part of the cell that are the single greatest predictor of your life expectancy. A 14% shorter telomere will probably predict about a 14% shorter life expectancy. And the telomeres of boys are even 40% shorter than the telomeres of girls. Now, what that is both scientifically solid knowledge that the lack of father involvement has a significant influence on your life expectancy, but it's also solid knowledge that there is even a greater impotence that is created among boys than girls. In every part of my analysis of the lack of father involvement hurts girls and boys in many different ways, but it has even significantly greater impact on boys than girls. So another way that it has an impact on both boys and girls is that an analysis by a large number of female social workers of ISIS recruits who were imprisoned and therefore had an opportunity to be studied, found that they didn't have anything in common except for the most part being males. And for the second most part, whether they were females or males, they had a lack of father involvement. So if you look at the implications of father involvement in terms of government involvement, the less fathers are involved, the more government has to step in to become a substitute father. the more the government has to step in to become a substitute security blanket for the country. So all of your government involvement, spending trillions of dollars on all of the Patriot Act and all its implications, all of the examination of everything that is going, all the protections that we needed to maximize our security, often at the expense of our freedom. That was, all of this can be traced back to a lack of father involvement. What the feminist movement never understood, they got the fact that women had sacrifices of careers, but they had no understanding of the sacrifices in careers. Men made a myriad of sacrifices in their careers. They oftentimes learned that they had to either be a warrior or a sole breadwinner. And if you're a warrior, you have to be potentially disposable. Part of what men's were about were disposability. To this day, 93% of the people who are killed at work are men, but a much even higher percentage of men who are killed from the black lung diseases of being a firefighter. One of my good friends was killed from exactly that at the age of 52, 53. He died from the black lung disease that came from him being a firefighter. And so the feminists never understood or gave credit to the sacrifices in work. They always made it seem like work was privilege, work was power. No, work was responsibility that gave up power. Pay is about a paradox. Pay is about the power that you forfeit to get the power of pay. That is, pay is about the power that you forfeit when you have to work 40, 60 hours a week at somebody else's behest, where you have to maybe move to a new location. It's when men have, we think of the pay gap as being discrimination against women. That is just plain not accurate. I wrote an entire book called Why Men Earn More, based on 8-9 years of research I did analyzing the pay gap, and found that there were 25 differences between what men and women do in their work-life choices. Every single one of those differences leads to men earning more money in the workplace. Every single one of those differences lead to women having a more balanced life, having more balance between the work and the home life. Now, if you define power as happiness, which is the way I define it, as opposed to the way men define it, which is power of feeling obligated to earn money somebody else spends while they die sooner, which is not quite a great definition of power.
Yeah.
When you define power as happiness, usually people who have balanced lives are happier. And so what women and feminists were not understanding is that basically the traditional female role had carved out more opportunities for happiness. But with that before feminism, many women weren't happy either, because they were like Betty Friedan or Gloria Steinem or Katie Couric or some other woman. They had ambitions that could not be fulfilled, and so the brightest and best women in many respects, and in terms of, and ambition-wise, were sort of left out in the cold. So the feminist movement came along and they gave to women the best possible combination: being honored and feeling not shamed no matter what they chose to do. So they carved out an atmosphere in which women could discover themselves. So that's one of the positive contributions of the feminist movement. One of the negative contributions of the feminist movement is that they demonized men, undervalued the family, assumed that we lived in a patriarchal world in which men made the rules to benefit men at the expense of women. Men did not make the rules to benefit men at the expense of women. If men did make the rules to benefit men at the expense of women, it would be female-only draft registration. Women going to war and dying while men had the chance to take care of children. It would be women paying for men. It would be addicting women to sexuality and making men feel repressed about sexuality, so that women would feel the powerlessness that comes from wanting sex when the other sex doesn't want sex. It would be requiring women to take the the sexual risks of sexual rejection when they were 13, 14, and 15 years of age, and fearing that they were not worthy of a man in their classroom, a boy in their classroom that they were taking the sexual initiatives with. We would have had women paying for diamonds for men, but men not paying for diamonds for women. We would have had women paying for dinners and drinks for men, and picking up men and driving and sending men flowers. And Valentine's Day would have been about showering men with gifts rather than women with gifts. This is, when we say that women are the oppressed class, all of these things all of our norms would be reversed if in fact women were the oppressed class. There were no groups of slave owners who bought diamonds for their slaves, and who bought dinners for their slaves, and opened the doors for their slaves, and and feared rejection by their slaves. This is not an accurate comparison.
When you have robust social institutions like families and churches and social gathering places, that's a threat to government control.
Yes.
And you say that Vladimir Lenin understood this. He was fundamentally hostile to the family.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Lenin felt that the nuclear family was part of a conspiracy on the part of men to oppress women, as opposed to understanding that the nuclear family happens to be the most ingenious structural institution that we've ever created for the healthy upbringing of both boys and girls. And I would not have made that comment with that amount of certainty in my voice before I started doing the 10 years of research that I've been doing on the boy crisis. Seeing the degree to which children who do not have mothers and fathers working in a checks and balances type of way, an equal power to each other, where the child comes home and is bullied, and the mother will say, I'm going to go in and report that bullying to the principal, and we will get rid of, we'll make sure we punish the bully. And the father saying, well, before we do that, why was he being bullied? And is there anything that we can improve about our son that allows him to take responsibility for the fact that he's been a victim here? Can we change that dynamic so he's not a victim in the future? And so then the mother says, well, wait a minute, are you blaming our son rather than the bully? And the father says, I care about my son more than the bully. That's why I want my son to not ever be in the position of being bullied again. And they have a big argument. Well, that argument has to be understood as a proper checks and balances, a healthy tension that leads the child to have some of the protection of the school, knowing as a result of the mom that there is a bully that needs to be checked, and the father's input that our son also needs to look at what is attracting bullies to him and what he can do about it. That's the type of checks and balances that need to happen all the time. You see this with a boy coming home and complaining, I have a teacher, or a girl coming home and complaining, I have a teacher that is, really hates me. And the mother wants to replace the teacher. As a rule, the father wants to say, you have to get along with people in life, so learn how to get along with this teacher. Either one of those philosophies can go too far. What is healthy for the family is having the father not feel that the moment that he says what he's said is he's demonized as being too tough on the child, because we know that too tough on the child is oftentimes very healthy for the child in the long run, but of course that can go too far as well. And so those are the checks and balances that the family has intuitively evolved that leads to children who are doing the best. The gap between the rich and the poor in the future will be the gap between the dad enriched and the dad impoverished. The gap between the dad deprived boy and the dad enriched boy is going to be the greatest predictor of economic health, of emotional health, and of physical health in the future.
So let's go from the depressing subject of Vladimir Lenin to a shocking discovery. You recruited, unbeknownst perhaps to yourself, John Lennon in your movement. Tell that story. It's such a cool story.
I discovered this when I was at a party celebrating for writers for Ms. Magazine, and Gloria Steinem and I had.
What year is this?
This is let's see, it must be about 1975, 76, somewhere in that area. And so Gloria Steinem and I had a sort of pact that we were going to meet afterwards and connect, but she was surrounded with people, and I wasn't. And so some guy comes up to me and says, "Excuse me, are you Warren Farrell?" And I go, "Yes." And he goes, "Well, I joined a men's group that you joined, but you had left the men's group before I had joined it, so I never really got to know you. But your men's group changed my life." And I go, "Whoa, how so?" And he goes, "Well, what happened was one of the questions you asked the men's group to ask is, what is the biggest hole in your psyche?" And I thought that was a pretty stupid question, but as it got around to me, I just blurted out with the fact that I guess the biggest hole in my psyche is that I feel like I never got to know my son, and I was so preoccupied with my business and my career when my son was born that I really neglected my wife and my children, and I ended up getting a divorce. And that divorce led me to coming over here to the States and getting remarried. And then he stopped for a moment and said, and I guess the reason it made such an impact on me was because my wife had just recently told me that she was pregnant, and we found out just very recently that we were going to have a son. And so he said that the men's group said to me, "So what do you want to do? You feel badly that you neglected your son and your wife in your previous marriage. Are you going to repeat that process again in this marriage?" And he said, "Well, I have a lot of obligations, and I can't really just, get them." And so the men's group confronted me, and they said, basically, "John, what you're saying, I think, is that, what you own owns you. And that's not really freedom. And by the way, have you ever checked with your wife about whether she'd be okay with you doing maybe a little bit more balanced life?" And they said, then they interrupted me and said, "Oh, by the way, what would you do if you could do anything you wanted to without regard to money, wife, obligations, anything?" And he said, what I said to the group was, my ideal would be that I'd take off full time for 5 years and raise my son before he goes to kindergarten or whatever. And the group said, "Well, have you checked with your wife about the possibility of doing that?" And he goes, "No." And he says, "Next meeting, you've checked with her, you get back to us, right?" And he goes, "All right." And he does check with her, and he said, "No, my wife said that whatever I wanted to do." And the group said, "Well, you have significant money, you can do what you want to do." And he said, exactly the opposite is true. "I have significant legal ties, legal obligations." And he said, I'm under contract after contract. It is impossible for me to do what I really want to do." And the group again confronted me and said, "How hard have you tried?" And so that began a process where I untangled those obligations, and I started to focus on how I was going to organize my life to be able to spend full time with my son for a few years. And I said to him, "Well, how long into this process are you?" And he said, "About a year and a half into it." And I said, "Was this a good decision?" And he just stopped and he said, "It was by far the best decision I have ever made in my life." He said, "I've written a lot about love." And he said, "I had no clue as to what love meant. Love is not about just you, me, figuring out how to love. Love is like when you figure out that how to put your son's arm through the coat in the right way, making sure that he's fed the right way at the right time, that you respond to him but don't over-respond to him. Every minute I'm focused on him. I've learned how to love. I feel like I've just become so much better a person as a result of that." So I said, "Truly best decision?" And he goes, "Yes. By far the best decision I've ever made in my life." And that was a really helpful moment for me because it let me see that here is one of the world's most powerful men. What happened at that time is I had no idea who he was. So the really funny part of the story was, and had also been so focused on my doctorate and my writing and my teaching and the multiple obligations I had in my life that I didn't ever watch TV, and most of the time didn't have a TV. So at this point in time, I'd just come back from my first book tour, had been on a lot of Phil Donahue type shows to begin with, in the Today Show with Barbara Walters, and some guy comes up to the table and says, "Can I have your autograph?" And I reach up to get the piece of paper and pen that he's holding, and he stops me and says, "Oh, actually, I was maybe hoping I could get the autograph of John," and I go, "I have no idea who I'm talking to." The mysterious John, and he goes, and John just quickly signs it. So I'm really, by the quickness with which he signs it and returns it, I'm aware that he's done this many times before. And I say, "Oh, you guess I'm so embarrassed that I was assuming it was me. What is your name?" And he said, "I told you, John." And I said, "No, what is your last name?" And he goes, "John Lennon." And I go, "Oh," and I'm proud of myself now. "You're a member of a singing group, aren't you?" And he goes, "Yes." And so I said, "What's the name of the group?" And he goes, "The Beatles." At which point in time I realized how ignorant I was, and the level of my embarrassment shot up.
So our viewers, they were starting to like you for a while, but this story, when I hear this story, I realize that John Lennon stopped making music for 5 years.
Yes.
And that it's all your fault.
I don't know about all my fault. I'll blame it on the men's group, right? But yes, I suppose I had a role in that, and everyone sees things through their own eyes. Yeah. I'm sure there were multiple, dimensions of influence that were involved in this process.
But you can also take credit for the album that he eventually made, which a lot of people view as some of his best work, and it's fundamentally transformed. I'm hearing some of the themes in your story that eventually did show up in his music. Mm-hmm. Warren, I want to thank you for doing this. This has been fantastic, and thanking you for taking the risk to speak with the enemy.
Oh, it's been a pleasure to meet the enemy.
Thank you.
The non-enemy enemy.
The non-enemy enemy. Right. Yeah, nobody got hurt.
Yes, no, and I don't, by the way, I don't feel there is such a thing as an enemy. If you start listening, you undo every enemy.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
You're very welcome.